I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I have the privilege to introduce this event. Association of Tigray Community in Canada and United Tegaru Canada would like to thank you for coming to this webinar, titled Tigray and Oromo Conflict, a look at the history, the Canadian context, and how to improve advocacy. We have invited members of parliament who have advocated for Tigray in Canada. Welcome. My name is Xian. I'm the chair of United Tegaru Canada, a not-for-profit organization. If you are not following us, please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok to stay up to date on the crisis in Tigray and how you can help. We are live streaming this event on YouTube at United Tegaru Canada. Please subscribe. I would like to say a special thank you to Dr. Tesfaye for facilitating this opportunity. We are all here because on November 4th, 2020, the Ethiopian government declared war on not only the elected government of Tigray, but its people too. For over 7 months, the innocent civilians have fallen victim to war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity by the Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara army. These crimes include rape, weaponized hunger, looting, bombing, chemical warfare, and killing of civilians, including children, elders, and prominent leaders. There are millions of internally displaced persons, and hundreds of thousands have fled to Sudan to seek refuge, and famine is now the reality. Tigray is not the only region in Ethiopia facing war. The Oromo region, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, is also being attacked by the Ethiopian and Eritrean government. Further, their prominent leaders have been jailed. Unrest in many regions is sadly a reality. These are just two examples. This is what brings us all here today. Our host for the Q&A is Giona, a member of United Tegaru Canada. Now, please allow me to introduce our guests, Dr. Young and Dr. Ararssa. Dr. Young has a PhD in political science from Simon Fraser University, located in Vancouver, British Columbia. His research affiliation is also with Simon Fraser University. Professor Young has written many books and journal articles. He is famously known for the Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front from 1975 to 1991. However, he has extensive experience in the Horn of Africa, including Sudan. Dr. Ararssa from Melbourne, Australia, is an Oromo advocate and law scholar who has written many peer-reviewed journal articles and has extensive knowledge in Ethiopian politics. We are honored that our guests have accepted our invitation, and we look forward to delving into their experiences, stories, and reflections on the political history of Ethiopia, the current conflicts, and an analysis on what the future holds for the people of Tigray and the Oromo people. With that, I turn your attention to our host for this evening, Giona. Take it away.
All right, so let's get this event started now. Sorry for the delay and the technical difficulties. Thank you, Tsian, and welcome to our guests and panelists. We are so honored to have you both with us here today, Dr. Young and Dr. Ararssa. And like Tsian mentioned, thank you, Dr. Ararssa, for joining us at such an inconvenient time for you in Australia. We really appreciate it. For the guests, the audience listening to our discussion today, if you have any questions that you would like us to ask, please post them in the chat box and we will get to them if we can at the end. Okay, so with that, let's begin. Okay, with that, let's begin. Our first question today is for Dr. Young. So for our audience, who may not know your field of work and your experience, can you tell us a bit about how you came to study the TPLF and the Horn of Africa more broadly, and how this area of the world became your life's work for research?
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Well, I certainly didn't set out to be a scholar on the Horn of Africa. When I grew up in a small town in the Okanagan Valley, and I probably hadn't seen an African until I was in my teens. So it was surely by happen chance. I ended up in London at one point, and there was an advertisement in the newspaper for an English teacher in Khartoum. And I went out to Khartoum. That was in 1986, and the place was a complete shambles. The country was falling apart. No electricity, no water, no nothing. And much of my English teaching didn't really amount to anything, but I got a job at a local newspaper, an English language newspaper, and that took me into the politics of Sudan. The editor was Bottom Wells, who's a very well-known figure today in South Sudan, and a fervent supporter at that time of the SPLA, Sudan People's Liberation Army. So I was imbued with that kind of politics of the SPLA, that kind of nationalism and that. And while I was in Khartoum, I started to meet all of these strange Ethiopians who were there from all of these different groups. TPLF was only one of them. It was OLF and EPDF, and I think there was Sadamo groups. Everybody was there. The Eritreans were there. So I started to meet these people. And in 1988, I was taken into Tigray by the TPLF. And at that time, the TPLF had captured all of Tigray with the exception of Mekelle. So I saw much of the country. I met Meles, I met Sabat Naga, I met Temrat Laney, if you remember him, the disgraced Amara prime minister at one point. So I met all those people, and I was very impressed with what I saw, particularly because my background was more with the SPLA, and they were in marked contrast to the SPLA. This was a highly committed organization. It had a very strong leadership. It was very ideologically focused. And crucially, and I certainly never saw this with the SPLA, they had a fundamental commitment to the welfare of the people. That's not common in groups that profess to represent groups, peoples in Africa. So I went away generally pretty impressed, and that kind of got me into the whole experience. The problem was by the next year, when I was really keen on the whole thing, and I had links with the OLF. I think they were going to take me into their territory. I was going to go into lots of people's territories. But at that point, I ran afoul of the Sudanese security services, and they made it basically impossible for me to do anything. I spent all my time down at the security offices in 40-degree temperatures. So that kind of ended my little projects. So I got out of the country in 1989, and then there was a coup right after that. The military came to power. That was Omar Bashir, who became the leader for the next 30 years. So when I came back to Canada, I started and did a PhD on the TPLF with a specific issue of how the TPLF actually mobilized peasants, because you can't just go out and shout slogans at peasants and expect them to rally around your cause. You actually have to get them on board, and I know that is extremely difficult. So that became my focus, and then I went back to Ethiopia and Tigray. I did my research there, got my PhD, and then subsequently wrote a book, and then I taught in the Political Science and International Relations Department at Addis Ababa University. But it should be stressed that it's not easy going for a researcher in Ethiopia then or even now. And particularly because I was seen in Ethiopia by many people as simply little more than a TPLF hack. And it was typical in Ethiopia that you actually get put in political boxes. And if you're in one particular boxes, it's very hard to interact with people in other political boxes. And that makes it very difficult to do research or to actually develop relations with people. And the contrast is very striking with Sudan, where it's quite possible to have friends in the Communist Party and the Islamist Party. That's not difficult at all. It's quite common with that kind of political culture. Ethiopia doesn't have that kind of political culture. So it becomes quite exhausting being there, I found. So what I ended up doing, not by any design, was flipping back and forth. And I went back to Sudan. I did a lot of work on the peace process in Sudan and the war in South Sudan. I worked as a military monitor, which was a strange job for me. I don't have any background in the military. I worked for the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter's organization, monitoring the elections and the referendum on South Sudan. And that became the basis of a book I wrote in 2012 on the peace process in South Sudan. And then I did a lot more jobs. I've had so many jobs, I can't really keep track of them all. But in later years, I worked an awful lot with US aid, with the US government. And that became the basis of another book I wrote in 2019 on the civil war in South Sudan and the subsequent peace process. But if I could just sort of take something away from that, it was that I ended up with a very critical, even negative view of Western dominated peace processes. I think you want to, at all costs, keep the Westerners out of your countries and certainly not let them dominate peace processes. Invariably, they'll make a mess out of them, as they did in Sudan and in South Sudan. So that was kind of my experience there. I've written lots of articles, but I've been involved in co-authoring 2 books recently. Well, one's not completed yet. One on the failure of the Western nation state in the Horn of Africa, because it was kind of adopted wholesale by African countries, this Western model. And I think it's been almost universally a failure in Africa. I think the TPLF would completely agree with me on that, because they didn't accept the Western model either. And I'm currently working on another co-authored book on the failure of Western democracy in the Horn of Africa. And I think you only have to look at the Horn of Africa to see that it has not taken root anywhere in the Horn of Africa. This is not an argument against democracy at all. It's just the cut and paste notion that you take things from the West and impose them on completely alien cultures in Africa. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And also, I think was the TPLF view, because they also didn't think Western democracy was going to be viable in Ethiopia. And Abiy Ahmed's government is in fact proving that it's not viable in Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. I don't know how many of us would characterize Abiy Ahmed's regime as a Western democracy or Western style democracy. But yeah, thank you so much for that very detailed answer. Next, I'd like to go to Dr. Ararssa. Could you tell us about your work and how you came to be an advocate in Ethiopia and built a strong reputation? You know, people love you or they hate you. So can you tell us how you came to do this work?
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Zion. Thank you, Tesfaye, for organizing this. It's an extraordinary privilege to be sitting on the same panel with Professor John Young, whose first book I had the opportunity to read, and from then on, whom I have considered as my teacher from a distance. It's an extraordinary privilege to be joining you today at a very early hour, and I had a misunderstanding about the time. Earlier on, I waited until it's 4 a.m. here, and then I took a nap for a bit, and it's now 6. So that's why I was late. I apologize for that. I am humbled to be referred to as an advocate. I have not always been considering myself as that. I am an Oromo from Ethiopia who grew up in Finfinne, Addis Ababa, which is not entirely very friendly to an Oromo person, and who always tried to make sense of what it means to be an Oromo in a multicultural, multilingual setting, or mostly Amharic-speaking setting in Addis Ababa. I am a student of Ethiopian constitutional law. and I started out my career as a legal academic, first at the Ethiopian Civil Service College Law Faculty, and later joined the Addis Ababa University Law Faculty, and also taught in the various institutions such as the Institute of Federalism, Human Rights, and Peace and Security, and so on and so forth. And throughout, I was specializing in Ethiopian constitutional law, and later I tried to write and research on the figure of the Oromo in the constitutions of Ethiopia, where I try to explore the role of law in constituting the national self and its others, and in the role of law, especially constitutional law, in defining the public life of the country and in framing it, and in extolling a particular notion, a particular idea of the state and its enemies, or its constitutive outside, its others. And this is because Ethiopia is obviously a multinational polity, a multinational empire, which always considered itself as a nation. And that's one of the causes, one of the problems with understanding Ethiopia, because it's not really a nation state. It is a multinational state at best, and it is actually a multinational empire. So I always look at the genealogy of othering in the historic constitutions of Ethiopia that implicitly and explicitly define the other peoples of Ethiopia, the non-Amharic speaking peoples of Ethiopia, as the constitutive outside of the state, mostly, especially the Oromo, as present in the territory, but not so present in the polity, in the idea that makes up the Ethiopian political community in the empire. When I do legal academics, I considered myself as a public intellectual, and I engage with political and constitutional issues of the country. I engage with the issues of constitutional interpretation, constitutional institutions, federalism, minority rights, human rights, management of diversity, and so on and so forth. And I was very much outspoken from the very start, in particular because I was also in my early years teaching at the Ethiopian Civil Service College, where most of the former leaders of TPLF and many other new recruits of EPRDF were studying at the Civil Service College. And I encounter these people who have been heavily involved in the struggle to depose the Derg, heavily involved in the making up of the constitution, and also most of them were in higher positions, the military, bureaucratic, and so on and so forth. So because I speak to the people who really are dealing with the public life, I developed this confidence to speak to them. You know, these are the people who am I afraid of. Of course, it's a great risk, but I did speak, and in that process of heavy, feisty, critical engagement, I learned quite a lot myself. And of course, from then on, even at the university, at Addis Ababa University, when I teach, I take it upon myself to speak truth to power. Maybe because I've been there as a teacher, I was a little too outspoken, and I took all the critical arsenals I have to engage with them, to argue with them. And I have always been like that, and I thought this is what an academic has to do. And at best, I would say this is the work of speaking truth to power. So in that process, I wrestle with critical issues that still exercise the intellectual and political energy of the nation. I wrestle with issues of citizenship and the place of citizens in the definition of the national self and its others. I wrestle with the issues of the challenge of diversity, the legacy of empire, and the mechanism of addressing the residue of dehumanization, because let's not forget that there was a sort of a racialized prejudice directed towards the peoples of the wider south of Ethiopia, primarily, of course, the Oromo. The legacy of subordination, even as the Ethiopian empire tried to assimilate all the other peoples into the what Tashalit calls is civilization, if you like. The legacy of exclusion and marginalization, the legacy of, most importantly, dispossession and displacement. When it comes to Oromia, you cannot try to understand the Ethiopian political conflict without understanding the memory of dispossession and displacement. And of course, the legacy of resistance against European colonial ambitions, which also in some ways, as far as the southern peoples of Ethiopia are concerned, entrenched an indigenous African imperial/colonial project. But for a bit, I also worked as the UNDP, where I was serving as a team leader for the governance and human rights section of United Nations in Addis Ababa. And I immediately went into the area that deals with the democratic institutions program. And I realized, I understood some bit of the inner working of the government and how one can engage with the democratization of the state in Ethiopia. And then, of course, I went on to do my PhD, and I came to the University of Melbourne here, and I ended up becoming an activist by default, because 2014 happened. In 2014, the resistance to the master plan, the Oromo protest to the master plan started. And when in March 2014, there was a protest in Jimma University and in Ambo University, students protested and there was violence. And then SBS Amharic, which is an Australian government media here, invited me to make sense of that. And I went out and talked about the constitutional legal framework, and I also talked about the sensitivity of the issue of land and development project in the area surrounding Finne and so on. And then suddenly that led me to VOA, led me to Deutsche Welle, led me to ISAT, led me to OMN. And then without my knowing, I became the international spokesperson for the Oromo protest movement. And I found myself being referred to as an activist, as an Oromo activist. And then, of course, I started to engage on critical debates in relation to what it means to be Ethiopian and so on and so forth. And then, of course, I became the pariah of the Ethiopian political class because I challenged that very nation of the identity of the identity of Ethiopia. So that brought me to the public eye, and I remained there ever since. The thing that impels me to speak out in defense of all minority groups in Ethiopia. I've been noted to be speaking about the Sidama, the Walaita, the Kamant, the Gumuz, the Berta, the Gedio, the Konso, the Mursi, the Anuak in recent years, because all these are flashpoints of political repression and violence from the Ethiopian state. The thing that impels me to speak is that I understand some bit of the legal parameters within which all these issues of the different groups in Ethiopia could have been handled rather easily without really demanding any violence, given the fact that we've got a constitutional framework which can accommodate all these things. The fact that the violence could have been avoided, that there was a constitutional legal infrastructure in place, that we could democratize and create the conditions necessary for a lasting peace, made me keep the hope alive, keep speaking about it, so that, the Ethiopian state has no problem of institutional structure to handle all these problems. And I always say, if you want to really, really solve the problem, the groundwork has been laid down. The dismantling of the infrastructure of empire has been there. And yet, to democratize it and go on to distance the brute force that is always attending to the Ethiopian political process. If you could just demilitarize the politics, anything can happen. Democracy can be done easily. Democratization can be done easily. That was the hope that led me into speaking out on these things. And I think that won me unwittingly for me, and very much to my surprise, a prestige that makes me an advocate for human rights and for various oppressed peoples of Ethiopia, the other peoples of Ethiopia, including now the Tigray, the peoples of Tigray. That is as much about what I could say about myself. Sorry it took me so long.
No, thank you so much for your answer, and thank you for the work that you do. Yeah, it is a benefit to all of the peoples of Ethiopia to have your voice. So thank you so much. The next question is on a topic that both of you have spoken a lot about and written about. So I know this could go on for days and days and days, but the question is about multinational federalism or ethnic federalism. Was it necessary when it was implemented? Why was it implemented? And do you see it as a net positive or negative in Ethiopia today? So I'll go to Dr. Young first, and then we'll come to Dr. Ararssa.
Yeah, I think in the circumstances, it was actually no option about to go to some notion of multi-ethnic or national federalism. The circumstances were that most of the groups that were out fighting the Derg, not all of them, but certainly most of them were nationally based. They were all opposed to a highly centralized state. After all, they've been fighting against it at one level or another under Menelik, under Haile Selassie, under the Derg. It was a fairly consistent pattern of national-based revolts and national-based movements. So that was what completely overthrew the Derg at the end of the day. The two most powerful groups, of course, were the EPRDF and the OLF. And on that fundamental issue, they were going to have lots of differences otherwise, but there really wasn't much disagreement at all on that. So once the Derg was overthrown, and my colleague here knows an awful lot more about the constitutional making than I do, but nonetheless, the reality was that the participants in the constitutional making process were heavily weighted towards that kind of perspective. And I think that perspective broadly reflected the realities and the sentiments in the country at the time. So national federalism was of some kind virtually inevitable. If there was no national federalism of some kind, almost certainly the country would have completely disintegrated after the Derg had left the scene. So they had to do that. The problems came somewhat later, and I don't know if we're talking about that later. My view all along has been that the two main forces in Ethiopia that were the most strongly committed to some notion of national federalism were the TPLF or the EPRDF and the OLF. And I think it was one of the tragedies of the last 30 years is that alliance did not develop between them. I understand very well while it didn't happen. I've talked to Oromo leaders. They were very suspicious of the TPLF. I think that's not entirely unwarranted. The TPLF, for its part, tended to look at its military record. And the TPLF military record is very impressive. They defeated an awful lot of forces along the way, and they militarily defeated the OLF as well. But what they didn't do was they were never able to defeat the popular support for the OLF among the Oromos. And that I don't think they ever really understood. And as a result, they never made the kind of moves to build a coherent kind of alliance with the only other group out there which was committed to some kind of national federalism. So instead of doing that, then they formed their own group, the OPDO, the Oromo People Democratic Organization, and it was always the weakest element of the EPRDF. So it was always something of an embarrassment in a way, and it had the weakest administration of the four main components of the EPRDF. And that became kind of a noose around their neck right until the end. And now we, in some ways, we're back in the same situation that we were in 1991, 92, 93, where again, these two major blocks are kind of toing and froing. And I would hope, although I don't have any reason to think, but I would hope that they might come again together, because they're now similarly victimized by this Abiy government. And I think they have similar strategies and philosophies on the way forward. But just to sum up, I think the system of national federalism is probably in great need of reform, but the reform, if it's even feasible, and I'm not sure at this stage in Ethiopia that it's even feasible, because I'm not sure that an Ethiopian state is any longer feasible, but if it is to be feasible, it will not be by centralizing power, by what Abiy is doing. It's in fact in going the other direction. There would have to be an awful lot more decentering of power and more power given to the ethnic regional states.
Thank you, Dr. Yan. Okay, so the same question to you, Dr. Ararssa. What is the value of multinational federalism in Ethiopia? Do you see it as a net positive or negative? And if you want to make a comment to Dr. Young's idea of the TPLF, OLF, strategic alliance, please feel free.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with what Professor Young said about the fact that the making of the constitution that enshrines the multinational federalism, in generally the negotiation towards the transition after the Derg was something that was done by various ethnic, if you like, but I don't like to use that word, and I will explain the reasons why. The nationalist liberation fronts, and if you look at the makers of the transitional charter in 1991 in the June conference, if you look at the profile of the people involved, the political parties involved are all national liberation fronts, except a couple of or 3 or 4 other organizations or people who represented various institutions, such as the Addis Ababa University by Professor Asrat, the trade union, of course, by someone from the Ethiopian Confederation of Trade Unions, and of course representatives of women, and so on and so forth. Other than that, most of the people that were negotiating towards federalism were basically national liberation fronts, and that had a reason. It is in some ways a resolution of the political tension, the political question that was framed as a nationalities question early on from 1960s student movement times, and that I think is the precursor of the multinational federal system that we have in place. Now, why was ethnic federalism put in place in Ethiopia? First of all, most people refer to, it is inaccurate, I believe, to refer to the federal system as ethnic. And most of the times it is the detractors that use that name and project that name to it. You will not find this word anywhere in the constitution, anywhere in the political language that tries to make sense of the Ethiopian political landscape. That name is projected onto it by people who are not entirely happy about the multinational federal structure. It also assumes the idea that I earlier mentioned in my introduction, which is that Ethiopia is a nation state, and rather than a country of many nations, the fact that it is multinational, and that there is an idea of the national, and there is everything else is something less than national. So that assumption, I think, is incorrect. Ethiopia is an empire. At best, it is a country of many nations. And that's precisely why a famous professor of constitutional law wrote a book, in fact, someone who is involved in the drafting of the constitution itself by the name Dr. Fasil Nahom, wrote a book in 1997, 2 years after the adoption of the constitution. And the title of the book is very telling about the multinational nature of the federal system and the constitutional system. And the title of his book is Ethiopia, a Constitution for a Nation of Nations. And that's, I think, apt and a proper description of the multinational nature of the federal system. National diversity, by the way, has always been a lived fact, I say. It has always been a lived fact, if only a denied norm. It wasn't normatively appreciated, or the diversity is an unwanted presence, kind of a nuisance, an irritant, something that makes the Ethiopian state very fragile, and hence, as you can see, the urban Ethio-Amhara anxiety that makes them chant that Ethiopia remains united, Ethiopia is not going to be dismembered. Even the prime minister repeats that, Ethiopia at first, and so on and so forth. So I call it the Amhara anxiety, pushing that. And that's because there is this fear that the presence of the other groups is always a burden, a cause of instability, a cause of, so it means that Ethiopia embodies the enemy from within. And that understanding, I think, is a wrong one. It relieves, if you understand that it is a multinational polity, really, it relieves you of all the anxieties of trying to keep it together. And it's so funny that you take all this burden when, in fact, the Constitution allows the right to self-determination, peacefully, amicable separation and formation of one's own state. And that anxiety is really incomprehensible. And in fact, it is irrational. Ethiopia was proud to call itself an empire until 1974. The Derg denied multinationality because they said there is only one nation and there are other nationalities. Nonetheless, true to the fact that the revolution of 1974 was made possible because of the student movement that also flagged the nationalities question. And because there was the injection of the national democratic program from the side of Mason and the student movement. The Derg itself recognized the right of nationalities to self-determination. Very interesting. In the 1987 PDRE Constitution, Article 2 talks about the right of nationality languages to be equally recognized. And second, the right of nationalities to self-determination. However, no cessation, because the territorial integrity and national unity of Ethiopia is sacred, sacrosanct. The republic is indivisible, inalienable. That's the Constitution. The multinational federal system that we have today is multinational because it clearly stipulates, this is clearly stipulated in the preamble. The beginning says we, the nations, nationalities, and peoples. It's very interesting that the transitional charter was negotiated on behalf of peace-loving forces. This is very interesting. You know, we, the peace-loving forces of Ethiopia. That's how the charter started. And this one starts with we, the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. With that one phrase, it establishes the fact that the polity is multinational, that the polity is multi-foundational, that all the nations are co-constitutive of the polity, and the polity is, of course, multicultural, multilingual, etc., etc. So it is multinational. And then you have Article 8 of the Constitution, which says that each nation, nationality, and people is sovereign. And then you have Article 39, which recognizes the right to self-determination after cessation, the right to cultural self-determination, language, history, narrative, culture, and the right to full measure of self-governance, which is basically pushing the state to be decentralized. And that was Article 39. The goal, if you look at the Constitution once again, and this is very interesting, the goal of restructuring the state in this way, it says of course, establishing democracy, rectifying historical injustices, and so on and so forth, historically unjust relationships. But ultimate goal, it says, is to bring about lasting peace. And again, the generation of the peace-loving forces that negotiated the charter is having, their voice continue to ring behind as a soundtrack, virtually, of the Constitution, and saying, we want this for a lasting peace. To me, as a constitutional lawyer, that is something that yearns for the demilitarization of Ethiopian politics, that the arms are out of the equation of the public life of the country, the way we manage the public life of the country. And that is the Constitution, that's the multinational, the making of the multinational federalism. So the purpose is bringing about lasting peace, rectifying historically unjust relationships, especially between national groups and religious groups. Let's not forget that in Ethiopia, it is only after 1974 that Muslims are considered to be co-equal citizens. And then thirdly, creation of a voluntary association among groups, because it says we come together exercising our right to self-determination to be united. So that sense of free association, sense of exercising one's collective agency to be a member of this political frame, and of course, enjoyment of the cultural dignity in the polity. Now that is the multinational federal structure. Now, politically, of course, multinational federalism is brought about as an attempt at resolving the long-standing nationalities question. Yes, it was mainly from the top. It is vanguard parties who came together that legislated this from the top, really. It was more like an elite pact, even though there was a constitutional assembly created without a free, fair election, etc., etc. Generally, I think it could be said that it is a multinational federal system that is kind of negotiated among elites at the top. From below, it can be seen as an attempt to center the margin, to bring in the periphery, the people, to bring in what John Markakis calls the other peoples of Ethiopia into the center. The people who, according to the Ethiopian epic poet Tsegaye Ararssa, are the people who have come from far away, Yedar Ararssa. So it is a project of bringing the unknown, the invisible people, whose language, whose voice have been unintelligible to the Ethiopian public square, and that was the dream, that was the vision of the Constitution project. The net effect you mentioned, was it positive or negative? I think we need to be a little bit specific about what we have achieved through the Constitution. I think the nations have found a homeland. Forget anything else, but every nation had the right to point to a place called its home, which it said it is entitled to govern, where it can exercise its sovereignty. So not every nation has found a state, but every nation has found a site that it calls home and governs it at the local level, could be district or whatever level, zonal level, or state level. So that is one achievement. And mind you, the anxiety of the peoples of the wider South today about Abiy's regime comes from the fact that site of sovereignty that they have achieved, the locus of sovereignty, local sovereignty they have achieved, will be taken away, is the fear. And so that's number one. The second is the linguistic self-determination was achieved, at least within their own locality. They can do education, they can do administration, they can do judicial services through their own languages. And people are very anxious about not losing these, even now in the face of Abiy's chant about unity and so on and so forth. And the third is the hope of full measure of self-governance. Yes, they were constituted, they have a government, but it has never been true that they have really achieved a full measure of self-governance, because EPRDF is a very centralized party, and because the party operates on the basis of the principle of democratic centralism. Not every locality has been so free to enjoy its self-governance, and no question about it. That's why the Oromo protest was calling for a Babiyumma, to govern one's own land, and so on. So people were looking for more decentralization at the end of 2017, not less. So there was this hope, embodied in the constitution, in the multinational federal structure, that we will have more self-governance. And then the representation, semblance of representation, although unelected often and undemocratic, of the selected elite in the Ethiopian government structure, in the executive, in the bureaucracy, in the diplomatic missions, and everywhere. And I always say it was a multinational federal structure that made it possible for Brahanu Adello, a Kafacho, to be the chief of staff of the Prime Minister's office when Meles was alive. It was this structure that made it possible for Asafa Kasito, a Shakacho, a very small group in the southwestern part of Ethiopia, to be a minister of justice. Or Ubah Muhammad, a woman, Somali woman, to be a minister of women and children. Or a Fawzia Muhammad, a woman, to be an Oromo, to be the ombudsman, the chief ombudsman of Ethiopia. Or Abdul Wase, a member of the House of Federation. Almaz Mekko, the first speaker of the House of Federation. Nagaso Gidada, an Oromo, to be the president of Ethiopia, and a number of other people ever since. And so when you look at this, there was also at least a gestural move towards making the country look more like the peoples in the country. So to this extent, it was a very positive move, and nobody wants to lose that. But what was the negative? The negative was its lack of democracy. Obviously, there was not a fair, free election that was agreed upon, that has taken place for a long time. The result is a misgiving, a disaffection everywhere. And then there was the bandwagon of economic growth and development. That was also attended by a lack of equitable distribution of economic resources. In fact, equitable distribution of the dividends of growth, as Meles was acutely aware. I remember when we had the International Conference on Federalism in 2010, his emphasis was on equitable distribution of the dividend of growth, the dividend of economic development, and the democratization of the federal setup. And they were already aware of this. And the net effect, therefore, to me, is that it was the first comprehensive positive step towards restructuring the state, democratizing the political frame, and decentralizing government.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ararssa. Okay, let's go on to the next
Deficient,
question.
but good step.
Okay, so for our next question, we're going to move more to present day events. Again, for Dr. Ararssa, can you tell us, how did the war in Walaga begin? And can you elaborate on what Oromo people are facing today in Ethiopia?
The war in Walaga began because of fundamentally the unclear terms of negotiation with the OLF in Asmara. You know, the thing is that when every opposition group was coming home from exile, the OLF, which was operating in Eritrea, also started negotiating with the group that was referred to as the reformists, like Abiy, Lamma, and so on. Lamma Magarsa, the then president of the Oromia region. And in fact, Abiy sent Lamma Magarsa as a delegation to negotiate with Daud Ibsa in Asmara. And they went there, and it looked like they have agreed on many things. And one of the things that they were agreed is the terms of disarmament, the terms of demobilization of the OLF soldiers and reintegration of the OLF soldiers into the security apparatus of the Ethiopian government, and so on, and other, the guarantee of freedom for the political leaders and for those who want to go home and to be relieved from any political or military engagement, because most of these people are conscripts of need. They weren't politicians, or they weren't soldiers by taking it as a career. They were just forced into it. They were conscripted by many situations. And so when I think they agreed, that agreement was supposed to be signed by Abiy. Abiy refused to sign it. And in spite of his refusal to sign it, because there was a general agreement, there was a general mood of agreement in the air. And also because Isaias was pushing the OLF out, threatening them to pay an exorbitant amount of money for the 20 years they stayed in his country. It's an extraordinary amount of money that I heard that they were expected to pay. Because they were under threat, they had to go, and they went without Abiy signing the terms of disarmament.
Can you tell us why? Why did Isaias, after all this time, demand a payment for hosting them?
It's an Isaias-Abiy pact. You see, the moment Abiy came to power, the first country he went into was Eritrea. Before even he began that famous tour across the country, he went there and he wanted to open the border to relocate the Northern Command, which was on the border. And you know how the Tigrayans resisted not to let the military to leave, because they were never sure that invasion would not happen, and so on and so forth. So there was this, in my view, a pact, a pre-arranged pact between them to deal with what is going on inside Ethiopia together. Because I think there was, look, the current situation we are in, and I will be saying this again at the end, the current situation we are in, one way, and I think a big way of understanding the current situation is to see that this is an extension of the unresolved political power struggle within EPRDF. It is the struggle to age out TPLF and to take over power. It was, for me, it's a power grab by the OPDO and ANDM wing of EPRDF by aging out TPLF. That was the whole thing. And it is that's what motivates Abiy, most of all. He keeps talking about in his years of struggle. What struggle did he have? He was only struggling for power against TPLF. I mean, if struggling against TPLF is a struggle for his nation, well, I think the people will judge that. But he keeps talking about it. So this whole conflict that you see today is still the result of the unresolved power struggle from within, and the anxiety of Abiy that TPLF will return, that they will take power again, from the wrest power from their hands, to secure that power, to maintain it, to consolidate it, and to keep it under his. So in order to do that, I think well ahead of time, he had been thinking of deploying Isaias's support. And this is also spoken about openly by the people who are basically the co-sponsors of all of the violence that he does today from Addis Ababa, which is the former Ligimbot Sabat, CUD, whatever group, Arbanyoch Kimba, whatever, and now they have morphed in Izema and so on and so forth. So these are the people who were basically saying the only way to crush TPLF is through using Asmara. So because there is this kind of relationship, subtle and hidden relationship, Isaias was pushing the OLF groups to go home without even clearly understanding the terms of the disarmament. So they were rushed to go home. They did go home. They started begging for what happened to our agreement. What happened? And nobody was speaking to doubt. And things weren't okay. Then what happened was a group that came from Asmara, a group of soldiers that came from Asmara went through Tigray and were put in a camp for rehabilitation and reintegration. About 800 to 1,300, I think, a maximum, and were left. What Daud has with him was this bunch of people. And then there was a breakaway group, fighters who were conducting hit and run type of guerrilla engagement in the southern and western areas of the country for a long time, because it was difficult to operate publicly. They do, small encounters here and there. And those people, now that the war is almost over, they had a free reign. They had a free capability to move around. And they were, of course, rearming themselves. And then when nobody is clear about the terms of disarmament, they said, we're not going to put down our guns unless it is clear that we are going to be safe in the political system. And then they saw the mistreatment of the soldiers that already are disarmed. And when they saw that, they said, we are going to stick to our guns, literally. And they stuck to their guns. And Abiy used that as an excuse to wage a war, literally, on the western and southern parts of Oromia and put the region under what is called command post, which is a de facto state of emergency for about 2 years before the war on Tigray started officially on the 4th of November. So that is what the war in Wallagga was, and lots of atrocities happened. Wallagga and Guji and Borana were basically the foretaste of, perversely of course, the foretaste of what we see, the atrocities we see in Tigray, the rape of children and women, the burning down of households, while people are inside, the devastation of harvests by fire, and the abuse of young kids, children, terrorizing the people in order to make them not support the political party that they are familiar with. All those things happened in Oromia before it happened in Tigray. And so that's, I think, what explains the war in Wallagga.
Thank you, Dr. Ararssa. Okay, back to Dr. Young. Dr. Young, did you anticipate the war in Tigray before it began? And if so, did you expect that civilians would be targeted as they have been?
Well, I was in Mekelle for actually the 45th anniversary of the TPLF, so that was late February 2020. By then, it was pretty obvious that a conflict was brewing, but I had no idea of the scale of it. I don't think, from the meetings I had at that time in Mekelle, that the leadership was even aware. Either that or they were hiding it. Again, we certainly knew it was coming. And I think the TPLF had, of course, already advanced the theory, which turned out to be the case, that Abiy and Isaias, during their frequent meetings, were in fact planning on some kind of squeeze operation on Tigray. But there wasn't the sense at that time of extreme urgency, which is what one would have expected if in fact they had really anticipated that kind of onslaught. And I can remember actually receiving a couple of emails from middle-ranking TPLF people 3-4 days before November 4th, and they were asking me questions about Sudan, which didn't suggest that they had anticipated that this onslaught was going to begin. Whether the war could have been prevented, probably not. It was a long time in the making. The TPLF, and I think by extension, the Tigrayans, had been the kicking boy, if we can put it that way, for a long time. They had been held responsible for all of the problems in Ethiopia throughout the whole country. That was a very common rhetoric. Anybody going to Addis Ababa just as a visitor like me would constantly hear that on the street and the taxis. That was simply what was why it was a virtual consensus almost there that all the problems. And this was at a time when I don't think the TPLF, which we can talk about later, but I don't really think the TPLF actually had that much power in the last years. But nonetheless, that sentiments were deeply ingrained in it. There was an attempt by the TPLF to develop a kind of federalist coalition in the last couple of years. Ultimately, it really didn't go anywhere. It's unfortunate, but again, I think because the TPLF and the Tigrayans have been so denigrated, and perhaps people did not see where Abiy was going with his attacks, that they weren't prepared to jump on board that, or they were afraid of another attempt at so-called TPLF domination, but it never really got off the ground. So while the TPLF was developing to some extent its military resources, particularly the Tigray Defense Force, which is the crucial actor here, I think now, not the TPLF. Anyway, Abiy and Isaias were actually far ahead of them in terms of the planning for what was going to come down. They had a long time and they had the perfect cover. After all, what were all these meetings about? Well, they were all about making peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia. That was what they were all about. And of course, this is why Abiy got a Nobel Peace Prize. But now we really have, and the TPLF actually said this at the time, but we now know that it was almost certainly true, that what they were doing was they were planning this attack on Tigray. So I'm not sure that much could have been done. Ethiopians also do not have a very good record when it comes to negotiations. They tend to move rather quickly to violent responses to political conflicts. And that's, a theme I'll keep mentioning here, because quite apart from this particular conflict, that is something that has to be addressed, because that has been the history of the country, and we still see it again now. So I think we're in a conflict which could not have been anticipated on the scale that took place, and it probably couldn't be prevented. I mean, that's a rather dismal prognosis, but I think that's what we're left with.
Thank you, Dr. Young. The next question will be for both of you. So when Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, the beginning of his administration in particular, for the first couple of years, he was hailed as a democratic reformer. He made symbolic gestures like having gender parity in his cabinet and allowing more political opposition, freeing political prisoners, welcoming those in exile. But since then, we see that he has probably more political prisoners now than the previous regime did. Elections have been postponed twice. And so the question now is, does this perception of Abiy Ahmed as a democratic reformer still live in the minds of the global leaders in the international community? And if this perception does not exist in the minds of international community anymore, how do you explain the very slow response to what's happening in Tigray and the relative silence to the plight of the Oromos? So let's go to Dr. Young first for that.
Well, I actually saw Abiy as a complete fraud from day one. I think we've seen enough of these kind of demagogues with their speeches about love and peace, and that when they start talking that should be a red flag to say that there's not much there, and there's probably an agenda which is not being presented at all. But it was a rhetoric that was certainly liked in the West. There was no doubt about that. And I think the rhetoric was also meant to appeal to Ethiopians who are living abroad. We remember that when Abiy traveled to the United States and that he treated as a god by many people. He was actually very favorably received when he first went to Tigray as well. Tigrayans wanted reform. I mean, they were presented as the bad guys in this whole thing, but in fact, they weren't very happy with the system in the last few years as well. So he played that. I think he played this idea of a Western democracy. He talked a lot about individual rights. That was very attractive to the West. He also spoke a language about neoliberalism and reforming the economy, which was very popular in the West. After all, the EPRDF-led government was, their economy was essentially a statist government. There was certainly lots of room for private enterprise, but some of the key areas of the economy, like telecommunication and the effective nationalization of land, all suggested that the economy was not fully open to the international community. And he was going to change that. And if we remember also that particularly Melis and the EPRDF were very adamant that the Renaissance Dam was going to be funded by Ethiopians, that Ethiopia was not going to get in hock to the international community. They had a very clear idea of what that would mean and how the international community could then turn around and blackmail Ethiopia. But Abiy said all the right things. He said he was going to privatize major sectors of the economy. He went and took out loans on the Renaissance Dam. And all of that was very attractive to people in the West. And when we say people in the West, we mean elites in the West. It didn't mean anything to the general population. He's obviously lost all of that kind of legitimacy that he acquired, but it gave him enough room to maneuver, and I think that was crucial in the early period, particularly when he was planning this assault on his enemies, the DPLF, the OLF, and planning his agenda. But of course, it hasn't worked out the way he planned. And I didn't want to suggest before when I said that he was a Democrat, what I was saying was he was using the rhetoric of democracy, and he was doing this for the obvious political reasons and why it would be popular and why it could have also deluded an awful lot of Ethiopians. But we see then that it fails. It did not have any kind of base. Democracy doesn't just come out of the air with some speeches by politicians. It has to be rooted in the society. And it wasn't rooted in the society, and certainly not that kind of democracy. And I have a lot of trouble with this word democracy as it's bandied about, particularly in the West. The EPRDF was not, in a Western sense, democratic. Very clearly, it was not democratic. You only have to look at the parliament and see that whatever it was, 99% of the members of the parliament were from the EPRDF, which suggests that it didn't have that kind of balance. But there were critical elements of the EPRDF which were eminently democratic, even if they were not recognized as such by the West. And I would highlight in particular, it's already been mentioned, the notion of national self-determination. This was a fundamentally a democratic demand of the large majority of Ethiopians. Now that notion is not generally accepted in the West as being intrinsic to democracy because we live in a largely individualistic society, but that was democratic. And the EPRDF also focused on the notion of economic advancement and economic equality. And these are also notions which have been essentially shunted aside in Western notions of democracy. So sort of presenting Abiy as an exponent of democracy and EPRDF as somehow completely authoritarian just completely lacks nuance and an understanding of what the realities actually were.
Thank you, Dr. Young. So then how do you understand the slow response to Tigray and the lack of a response really to what's happening in Oromia, if it's not out of this belief that Abiy Ahmed is a reformer or was a reformer?
Well, I think first off, as we know, this attack on Tigray started on November 4th, which was not a coincidence. That it was the date of the American election. So it was meant to be kept in the dark, or the international community was to be kept in the dark for a long time. But as the human rights abuses have been virtually impossible to ignore because they're being expressed all over the place in the media, the West does have to deal with it. I mean, we can talk about the Canadian response later, but I think that there was probably a couple of concerns about taking a more hard line on these abuses, which are clearly apparent. And one was that they fear that the Ethiopian state may dissolve. And I don't think anybody in the West wants to see that happen. And when they look at the opposition groups out there, notably the TPLF and the OLF, these are not groups which support necessarily, well, certainly not the TPLF, does not support a reformulation of the Ethiopian state. I'm almost certain they will opt for independence. So the international community is not going to feel very comfortable with that. They almost certainly are extremely annoyed with Abiy for causing these problems, and for now their television screens, just like in the 1980s, are going to be filled up with pictures of dying and suffering people. They don't want that. They don't want to deal with all of the aid programs, but they may have a sense that they're stuck with this guy in some sense. And then the other is, although Abiy is someone who has presented himself as a great friend of the West, he says he emulates the West, he wants to have a capitalist economy like the West, I think they're secretly afraid that he might actually jump ship and join with the Chinese. Now, I'm not sure that the Chinese particularly want him. They actually haven't given any condition, but Abiy is not a man of great principles. He's a man of rhetoric, and he's rather intellectually shallow. So they might be concerned about that. And we have to realize that in the West, human rights are something which have become instrumentalized. In other words, what that means is we make an awful lot of noise in the West about human rights abuses if it takes place in countries that we don't like. But if it takes place in countries that we do like, we tend to look the other way. So human rights is kind of, it's a political football. And it can be used if it's seen as advantageous to raise that banner in the West, and it can be ignored if it's not. I think the West is going to take a harder line. I think it already is taking a harder line. Particularly, I think noteworthy are the economic sanctions that the Americans have brought down, and I think the EU is supporting. This is where Abiy has got himself in a classic problem. The EPRDF did not want to get international loans because they knew they could be used to blackmail them. And now that's precisely what Abiy has done. And he is getting blackmailed now by the IMF and the World Bank, which are controlled by the US and the EU, because they are not going to give him the loans. So I think these things are coming down, but the West will be careful as they roll this stuff out.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Dr. Ararssa, do you understand the West's response to Ethiopia being that they believe that they're stuck with Abiy Ahmed? Do you think that explains this delayed response to everything that is happening in the country?
He had this image of a reformist that was projected both by him and his supporters over time. But I think that image is, as Professor Young said, is tarnished now. The US and the EU have effectively despaired upon reform. It's very interesting that at this point in time, no one is talking about even the reform agenda. The people are actually saying, postpone the election. You know, normally if it was about democratic reform, you know, they say, make the election free, fair, competitive, credible, etc., etc. That's not what they're very much eager about now. And I think Abiy's folly has been understood for what it is at this point in time. You see it from the fact that most of the heads of state don't speak to him. They send their emissaries, they send their diplomats not talk to him. When foreign ministers go, they don't even talk to him, but the other ministers and so on. So they have despaired on that. The UN, the US, the EU, to the extent that these represent the international community, are all disgusted by the atrocities that we have seen in Tigray. They are not, in some ways, yes, they are stuck. They are looking for an exit strategy in some ways. If there were a possibility for them to exit from this tacit deal with Abiy at the start, it's almost a tacit deal when you see the Nobel Prize given to him, and everybody was hailing him as the future of the democracy to come. But they don't know exactly what to put in his place. Also, they don't know how to do away with him and what to put in his place. The one thing is also very clear. You know, a genocidal leader usually is created. If you look at the anatomy of genocides elsewhere, it's created when there are three major situations that make it possible, conditions of possibility. First is a problem of failed state, when state fails to deliver what it is supposed to deliver. And because of the protest movement beginning from 2014, really, but 2015 up until 2017, the state obviously has failed to deliver, and it was shaken to the core, and it was kind of becoming very weak in Ethiopia. That is a very important precondition for genocidal leaders to emerge. That's the first step. And then the emergence of a demagogue. The emergence of a demagogue that also scapegoats, uses scapegoating, pointing to some other people for its failure. That is the second thing that happens. If you look at the genocides in Rwanda, in Kosovo, in former Yugoslavia, and in other places as well, it is always preceded by a failure of the state, then the emergence of a demagogue with an anti-democratic sentiment, really. And in spite of the rhetoric, which is very empty, really, when Abiy speaks about it, it doesn't have any institutional backing. It doesn't have any substance, really. He was obviously a demagogue that tried to galvanize some degree of support among people. And then he exploited the sedimented prejudice that reigned that existed in the country. And the third thing that he needed was he exploited the weakness or the sluggishness of the international justice machine. So the international community has its own way of doing things, the United Nations Security Council, etc. It's very slow, and it's meant to be dysfunctional to a certain extent. In the use of force, for example, the Security Council is deliberately made to be dysfunctional in the sense that the veto power freezes decisions rather than enhances and expedites decisions. So most of the times, genocidal leaders use these three things. They exploit the failure of the state to point to some group to blame, to use for scapegoating, and they flourish in this populist language, and they exploit the sluggishness or the dysfunctionality of the international community. And often they hide behind the principle of sovereign immunity to kind of get away with it, to ensure their impunity. And these are the things that have become real in the case of Abiy. And I think the international community needs to act swiftly in order to arrest this madness that we see in Tigray today and in Oromia as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ararssa. We are running out of time, but we still have more questions to ask. If you're both comfortable with staying, we would love to hear more from you both. So I'll ask one more question to Dr. Young, and you guys can get back to me with that. So for our next question, Dr. Young, today it is the 215th day of the genocidal war in Tigray. So a systematic campaign of weaponized starvation, mass rape, over 200 documented massacres has persisted with not even a strongly worded statement from our Prime Minister in Canada. So why hasn't Canada done more to stop the genocide, to oversee the departure of Eritrean forces, and to mount an effective relief operation?
Okay, well, first of all, I may shock your audience by saying something which to me is obvious, is that Canadians tend to have a rather naive view of Canadian foreign policy. They tend to see it as very progressive and Canadians marching around the world doing wonderful things for all these poor people in Africa and Asia. And in fact, nothing could be further from the case. Canada's foreign policy is deeply reactionary. It has always been deeply reactionary. We support right-wing coups who are all around the world. In Bolivia against elected government. We're trying very hard right now to overthrow the Maduro government in Venezuela. We've supported right-wing dictatorships in Haiti. We support apartheid in Israel. This is actually the common pattern, not that Canada is out in the forefront at all of being progressive. So I don't think we have to have, or we should have, any kind of expectations that they're going to be up there in the front line waving the banner of freedom and calling about human rights. And we also know that while Canadians might think that they have this very positive image internationally, that in fact is not the case. When the previous Stephen Harper government tried to get on the Security Council, they were deeply embarrassed because they couldn't get the votes. When the Trudeau government came in, they kept telling us that we had a different foreign policy. We have a feminist foreign policy, apparently. I've never seen any indication of it, but that's what we're told we had. But that line didn't wash either, and Canada didn't get votes to get in the Security Council for the second time. So there's that. There's the other thing is, I haven't worked a lot for the federal government or foreign affairs, but I have worked for them. What struck me then and still strikes me now is Canada's not a leader, it's a follower. And if you look at the Horn of Africa, you can look at one small country, Norway, which has a population smaller than that of Toronto, and it has far more influence through all the countries of the Horn of Africa than Canada does. Canada's not going to take the initiative. There's another element which might be peculiar here, and that is, from what we know, that Trudeau, when he visited Addis Ababa and met Abiy, they seem to get along really well, which didn't entirely surprise me, because I think in some ways they have some things in common. I think they're both heavy on style and rather weak on substance, so they might have fed off of one another. But I think the Canadians will take a harder line, and they'll take a harder line for very pragmatic reasons. And that is because the Americans, particularly, and to other extent, the EU, are taking a harder line on these economic sanctions and providing the correct votes in the UN. And Canada foreign policy has generally been to follow the US. So I think it will do it this time as well. But it's waiting for the big guys. And that's what I always saw when I worked for them. They used to say it often among themselves, among the diplomats. They would be looking for a small niche area that they could be involved in and leave the big issues to the big important countries like Britain and US and France and things like that. It's unfortunate, very much part of the the mentality of what's now called global Canada.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Okay, Dr. Ararssa, what is the future of Ethiopia? A centralized government, deepening national federalism, or collapse? What's your prediction?
That's a big question, but I will try to make it as brief as possible. For once, I would be very brief. And decentralized government is not an option. It's not even a choice. It has been tried and found wanting. It has been tried and failed spectacularly and sometimes catastrophically. And I don't think that's the way to go. And I always said, even if Abiy remains to be unimpeded, I mean, even if nobody resists his centralizing urge, he would just hit the wall, because that's not the nature of the polity. And some degree of federalist self-rule has been exercised. And as I always say, if once the wheels of federalism have started to run, you can try to stop it only at your own peril. The states will only want more space of maneuver, not less. And they would scream quickly to any centralizing urge if there were, if there was a democracy. Any centralizing move would be immediately provoking a constitutional argument, a constitutional debate, and they would say, oh no. And in our case, absent democracy, absent electoral legitimacy on the part of Abiy, any move to diminish what the states had so far in the name of centralization, in the name of returning the unitary system that used to be here, would basically lead him to a confrontation in many directions. And that's actually what's happening at this point in time. So that's not a choice. The second is the collapse of state and dismemberment, and going our own ways and going into fragmenting what has hitherto been known as Ethiopia. I don't think that's also an option. The reason that's not an option is because we are very intensely interdependent, and the peoples of the Horn of Africa are very interdependent, and they have a shared common fragility in a very geostrategically globalized corner of the world. Because geostrategically, many forces are operating in that area. And if we have gone our own ways and fragmented, it will be very difficult to win an international consensus on the one hand, and to also be really viable in a very hostile neighborhood of small states around in the entire neighborhood. But, well, that's for the people to decide. I think the best option would be a truly genuine multinational, a genuinely democratic, a genuine federal system that has to be renegotiated, if you like. A rededication would be needed among the groups in that area. I understand that Tigray has despaired on Ethiopia, and there is no security that it can survive the hostility of some of its neighbors. Obviously, especially now that there's this war on the borders of the Amhara region is really something that is not going to be easily subside. And given that situation and the animosity that you see everywhere in the country, of course, unleashed by the rhetoric of Abiy, as Professor Young was saying, Tigray has despaired. And now people talk of a country called Tigray. And I think normally to form a country, to secede and walk away from Ethiopia shouldn't have been an issue because the constitution allows it. It is a right, even if nothing has happened, you know, not because you have injustice, you have genocide, you have war, no. Even if nothing has happened, if you so will, you can have your own country. That was what is possible. I think given the circumstances now, no one can stand. I mean, it was a constitutional right to secede before. It is now a moral right for Tigray, for a stronger reason, you know, for whatever has happened, to find an exit. However, I also say, as an Oromo person, whose, you know, some of the organizations I speak for, in some ways, are organizations that have been fighting for the liberation of Oromia, and the restoration of collective agency and for enjoyment of our sovereignty and so on and so forth. Some of the Oromos have long despaired on Ethiopia. This country cannot be democratized. You are simply trying to be hopeful where there is no reason to be hopeful that it will be democratized, people say to me. So there has always been this argument that Ethiopia can only be decolonized. It can never be democratized. And federalism, whatever you talk about, all sorts of structure, can work only post-decolonization. And my view is that the arsenals of decolonization are already in the constitution. Decolonization can happen through self-determination, and that is there. All right. If you exercise self-determination, if you get your collective agency, then what you do is to determine your destiny through a referendum. All right. So it is possible, if there is a truly democratic, truly multinational federal structure, which does not militarize the politics. Now, this is the option we have. However, for a voluntary association and a rededication to the multinational federal setup, first there has to be peace. Then there has to be democracy. There has to stop, you know, hostilities have to stop. And some kind of basic consensus about the direction that the Ethiopian state takes into the future has to be there. And from what I see now, there is nothing that comes from Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa is only wanting to subdue everybody by force, by military might. And I don't think that will help, but it's not easy to also push the other options. One option is a no-go area. The other option is a very difficult option, and the more difficult option is the multinational federal system. It is the great utopia, but it is a very difficult option to handle. And of course, all political leaders need to be mature enough to choose the difficult but the plausible, the rational option to take. But of course, existence precedes all sorts of political maneuver, and as far as Tigray is concerned now, survival is at stake.
Thank you, Dr. Ararssa. For Dr. Young, we have an audience question. So, should the TPLF go ahead for the right?
Answer the same question as well.
I'm sorry?
Could I answer the same question as well? Because up until now, I pretty much agreed with everything Professor Regessa said, but I actually disagreed with him on this point, so it might be useful to make the point. I'd make a few points. First of all, we have to appreciate that the Horn of Africa, in some ways, is very unique in Africa. That nowhere else in Africa have you had any secessionist states. In the Horn of Africa, we've already had two. I think Tigray will separate. I think Ethiopia will disintegrate. And I don't say that with anything other than deep sadness that is the reality. But I think it has come to that. I think when you go back to the early years when the TPLF fought the Derg, my sense, I might be wrong, was that most Tigrayans wanted independence at that time. And that the TPLF notion of national federalism, of Article 37, which granted the possibility of secession. All of that was part of a broader ideology of the TPLF, which they drew from the Bolsheviks, as I've just written. But it was also a way of responding to the deep nationalism and sense of isolation of the Tigrayans. But I think now it's seen as a failure. I think that's the way Tigrayans have seen it. And certainly the one sense I did get when I was in Tigray the last time, that was before the election there, was that the sentiments again for secession were very strong. And that was before the war. I don't think any TPLF or Tigray Defense Force position could be, in the circumstances, anything other than secession, simply because it is so widely the sentiment of people at the grassroots level. And there's also something else here, which I think is worth talking about. As we keep talking about the TPLF, I'm not sure that the TPLF is the main actor anymore in Tigray. I think it is probably the Tigray Defense Force. And it is I don't pretend to know very much about this organization, but I think it's of slightly different character than the TPLF. The TPLF was deeply ideological, had a national vision, I mean, beyond Tigray. It had a world kind of vision. The TDF is much more locally focused. It's brought in a lot of different people, Tigrayans who did not like the TPLF at all, for one reason or another. Probably they got kicked out of the organization by Meles before. And what links them, again, is simply Tigrayan nationalism and wanting to get out of this country, which has brought them incredible harm over the last few months. I don't think there's any mistaking that. How they will do that, how long it will take to do that, I have absolutely no idea. What I do know was that in the first war, the Tigrayans showed remarkable resilience and commitment to their struggle. And I have no doubt that they will show the same resilience and commitment again. And if Tigray leaves, and I don't know what form that Tigray would be, whether it includes parts or all of Eritrea or what, I have no idea. I think that will take a long time to tell. But I think it's kind of on the cards. And if Tigray goes, I'm not sure where other groups, particularly the Oromos, whether they're going to stay in this rump state of Ethiopia. And again, I think that's a very dismal projection and one that I don't feel happy making, but I think it reflects the present realities.
Thank you, Dr. Young. I have to say, I don't know many Tegaru who don't wish for an independent Tigray, so yeah. Dr. Ararssa, would you like to respond to that about the country?
I have no disagreement at all. I have no disagreement with that.
Okay, then I have another audience question. So from the audience, let's go to Dr. Ararssa. Do you think that the Ethiopian economy is ready to be completely based on a capitalist market, as that is the direction Abiy is taking us in?
You know, from the very start, when Abiy started to talk about building a capitalist society, when he went to Davos and he said, we are going to build a capitalist economy. Right? Although I had doubts about whether he knows what he's talking about. At the time, I was very curious, because if you look at the protests of the last few years, it was if you look at the demands projected in the course of the protest, there was a demand for social justice and, for access to opportunities, for access to social services, housing, health, education, infrastructure, road infrastructure, water infrastructure, It was all about demanding more of the dividends of economic growth. And the one thing that actually galvanized the Oromo protest movement, the Oromo youth, was the massive unemployment among youth, especially new graduates of universities. And I remember at the time, the Opidio leader and this House Speaker, Abadullah Gamada, saying, "I'm very happy about this protest," he said. "I'm very happy because in some ways this protest is it shows our success in the last few years in making education, higher education more accessible to young people and getting more people graduate. But then what we didn't get ready for is we didn't create a space, an economy that can absorb that much trained manpower." And he was obviously siding with the young people who were protesting at the time. And this is partly what brought the reform group, Lamma Magarsas and so on and so forth in Oromia. They said, we've got this kids, about 1.5 million graduates, I think, across the nation at the time who did not have jobs. Now, if the protest movement itself from very recent past is a demand for more social justice, and not just in terms of economic redistribution, but also representation, having representation and voice, and also some degree of broader cultural recognition as far as the Oromo is concerned, access to the city and claim over the city, special interest claims, and having our language as one of the working languages of the federal government, and so on and so forth. Yeah, there is this cultural recognition demand, but there is also the demand for voice and representation. But the most important demand was basically socioeconomic justice. If that is what you piggyback upon in order to get to power, how do you try to address that through a capitalist economy? I mean, through how you say in the words of Abiy, capitalist economy. I don't think liberalization will address that. I don't think liberalization is good for Ethiopia, let alone liberalization. The developmental state model that Meles was presiding over, it in itself could not absorb the social justice demands, let alone the free market kind of economy that Abiy Ahmed talks about. And by the way, he talks about liberal economy, prosperity, and so on and so forth. But from day to day, life has become very, very unlivable, even in the urban areas that are far removed from conflict and war. And I do not think, by any stretch of imagination, a free, liberal, a neoliberal kind of political economic game can solve any of the problems in Ethiopia. In fact, it might exacerbate the already existing problems. As far as Oromia is concerned, one of his great mantra about liberalization is basically, even from, he is basically advised by the Izema group, is privatization of land. And privatization of land means, something that is simply unthinkable as far as the Oromo and the peoples of the wider South are concerned, And in fact, de facto privatization of land at this point in time, without even constitutional legal reform, has created the situation that you have seen in Oromia, and that's what created the combustible situation of the protest movement. And I don't think it will really address the problem.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ararssa. Okay, one more question for you, and then we can go to closing remarks. So, in regards to the Oromo protest movement, the movement that brought Abiy Ahmed to power, there was an Oromara alliance between the Amara communities and the Oromo community. Do you suspect that Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea had any hand to play in this alliance coming to be? Dr. Ararssa.
In putting together the Oromara Tactical Alliance, I don't think he has a hand. But I think they relied on him to age out the TPLF, part of the EPRDF, through what we see now. However, their alliance from the very start was only a tactical one even in a very, very limited sense, even that in a very limited sense, meaning just aging out TPLF. Other than that, there is nothing, not a single principle they agree upon, because the Amhara nationalists' ambition from what we see, whether it is ANDM or Amhara Prosperity Party as it stands now, or all the other more ultra-nationalist, more explicit Amhara nationalist groups, their ambition is imperial. Their politics is not about Amhara region, not a single one of them. It is about land in Tigray, land in Oromia, land to be reclaimed from this and that place, okay? Taking this place and that corner as their father's inheritance, the rest, all right? It is very expansionist and more like, the Serbian sense of messianic sense of saving the Serbs in Bosnia, in Croatia, etc. It's like the Amhara in Oromia, the Amhara in the south, the Amhara in Somali, that is their concern, not the Amhara in the Amhara land. And the attack on Command and Agau and Gumuz and the borders, and the Command and the Agau within Amhara region shows to you that you put it in any way, the Amhara nationalism is more imperial, outward looking, outside of their own national base, outward looking and imperial. And if that's the case, you see the insistence on making Addis Ababa free of all the regions, free of Oromia, basically. That's what they're trying to talk about. And when you look at that, there is just no way that Abiy's Prosperity Party from Oromia and his Prosperity Party from Amhara can really be bedfellows. There is just not a possibility for them to be uniting on the base of principle. They are very strange bedfellows for now, and they are going to come at loggerheads as soon as they have pushed away the other enemy. But I don't think it's already, the discord is already visible. They issue resolutions after resolutions on one another, and I don't think that's a very tactical, but they used it only to age out TPLF. And this is why the conflict that we see today is primarily a conflict of internal power struggle within EPRDF. It is unresolved. Faith is getting out of control. And there, Abiy mobilized the people who have grudges historically against TPLF and the Tegaru in general, against OLF and the Oromo in general. And these are the Amhara nationalists within and outside of the Prosperity Party structure. And just as they mobilized the people who have grudges against the other peoples of Ethiopia, they now enlisted Eritrea, who had its own reasons for holding grudges against Tigray, and so on and so forth. And he is part of this madness that we see now.
Thank you, Dr. Ararssa. Okay, we'll move on to just final thoughts and some advice we're looking for from the both of you. So for the greater diaspora communities, the Tegaru communities, the Oromo communities, what should we be doing that we are not doing to bring an end to the madness in Ethiopia right now? And what should we be calling for our governments in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere to do to stop what Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki have done to our countries? So we'll go to Dr. Young first, please.
That's a pretty big question, particularly for a political scientist. I'm not sure I can answer that very well. I think one thing we can all do, I suspect we all agree on this, is we can challenge the kind of history that's being written now, the kind of understanding of what the nature of this conflict is, and challenge Abiy's notions that he's projected about the evil TPLF, the authoritarianism, all of this kind of thing. One of the saddest features, I think, about what's going on right now is the enormous achievements that have taken place in Ethiopia are simply being forgotten about. I mean, it's as if they never took place at all. But anybody who had seen Ethiopia 30 years ago and sees Ethiopia now probably would have trouble recognizing the place. There has been so much that was accomplished. And particularly, I would point to the economic growth rates. I mean, they're simply denied by Abiy and his supporters. But the simple fact is that for 15 years or more, Ethiopia was in the very top league of the world. It was probably number 2 or 3 for growth rates. But more importantly, even than the growth rates themselves, was the fact that that growth actually was translated into real material benefits for the enormous poverty-stricken population of Ethiopia. You saw it in terms of health, education, services, massive increase in life expectancy. All of that is actually there. It's completely denied by Abiy and his followers, but the evidence, you don't have to go any farther than the World Bank and the IMF. Now, of course, they have a response to that as well. The response is that the World Bank and the IMF got all fake figures from the EPRDF. But the reality was the World Bank and the IMF did not like the TPLF and EPRDF economic program at all. They were completely opposed to the developmental state. They liked what Abiy was talking about, but they simply could not deny the realities of the achievements of the government at that level. And I think we have to make sure that people understand that, and that what Abiy is doing is he's taking away those achievements for his personal self-aggrandizement. His view is Ethiopia becomes a great country because he builds a big palace, because he makes big speeches. And this is the definition of a great country, and this links Ethiopia with some kind of mythical past. That's not my idea of a great country, and I don't think it really is for most Ethiopians. What is a great country is a country which can meet the basic needs of its people, and Ethiopia was moving in that direction. There was many problems. The fundamental problem, I think, and it's been referred to here already, is that the EPRDF rejected the notion of Western democracy, and I shared that sentiment with them, but they were not successful in coming up with an alternative vision of democracy. We must recognize the failures and the weaknesses, but we also must recognize the achievements, and those achievements right now are being lost. The other point I would make, and it's really not any advice, but it's just something I think I feel I have to say, is that like you, I read these reports every day of these terrible sexual abuse and these killings of young men in Tigray, but certainly not in Tigray. I read it in Benishangul, I read it in Oromia, and I'm very, very disturbed by it. And my sympathies go out to you people who obviously have families there. So I express my condolences and deep regret for what's going on.
Thank you, Dr. Yan. Back to you, Dr. Ararssa. What is your advice for our communities, either together or separately? What should we be doing, and any final thoughts?
I think the most important thing to remember at this point in time is that this war on Tigray is a war on the other peoples of Ethiopia. You know, unless we kid ourselves, it is a war on other peoples of Ethiopia, and that's no accident that it started there. It's no accident that it is going back there. I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say. Eritrea was enlisted in the attack of Tigray, and Eritrea is now extending its presence further into Oromia because of this. And the Amhara Special Forces have been deployed in starting the war in Tigray. They have been deployed in Oromia across the border in Wallagga already. And they just change uniforms and go into Oromia Special Force uniforms and then go on attacking people. Now, this war, therefore, is not just a war on Tigray. Obviously, it's not about law enforcement. It's not about anything such as that. There is no law to be enforced in that area. He went to Tigray because Abiy thought Tigray supports the resistance groups in Oromia, in the south, for example, in Walaita, when they were demanding their statehood, in Sidama. And I remember the then president of the Amhara region, Temasgen Turuna, saying that everywhere we have been fighting the wave that the TPLF spider has spread around. Now we go back to the roots and we will crush the spider itself. This, he said, just before the war on Tigray began. So this tells you that this war is not just on Tigray, it is a war on the other peoples of Ethiopia. And I want the international community also to understand, and us first and foremost to understand, that the end of the war on Tigray in favor of Abiy will not be the end of war in Ethiopia. It will not. And that's what they thought when he said it is a law enforcement measure and it's going to be wrapped up in 3 days or in 72 hours, in 3 weeks, in 6 weeks, etc. That's what they hoped for. I just want to stress that it is only going to be the beginning of more wars in the other parts of Ethiopia. And indications are there already. The fact that the Eritrean forces are also relocated now in Oromia shows that. And it is going to be an endless series of war, violence, and madness that is similar to what we have seen, unfortunately, what we have seen in Tigray. And if this is the case, then I think on our part, what we need to do is to do our resistance in a systematic, in a sustained and coherent manner, and in a more comprehensive manner. Because, for example, in Oromia, I say the kind of attack that is assault that's coming now is very comprehensive. They say they are out there on the media outlets saying, we are going to kill Oromos, we are going to break up Oromia, and we are going to eradicate Oromo identity. I mean, it's comprehensive, your identity, your region, and of course, they say these extremists, this nationalists, etc., have to be killed or imprisoned. That's what led to the arrest and attempted assassination of Jawar Mohammed and all the political leaders and so on and so forth. So if this is the case, then your response should size up to that kind of comprehensive assault that is directed against you. And the war in Tigray has showed that it's not just comprehensive, it is basically a war of elimination. And that's the fundamental logic of that war, elimination and destruction of property, perversion. It's total. It's a total destruction of a whole society. If that is the case, then it is up to us, and I have already indicated the interdependence of the people in the Horn of Africa and the common fragility that we experience in that region. And especially those of us who consider ourselves to be the other peoples of Ethiopia, the oppressed peoples of Ethiopia, the ones who have been on the receiving end of all sorts of political violence from the Ethiopian state. It is up to us now to hold hands and to stand together in solidarity. We have a principle that we can build upon. There is every reason to, there is solidarity as compatriots, there is humanity that can unite us. And there is every reason, because we've got the same kind of aspiration, the same kind of struggle. It's no accident that the OLF and the TPLF were in unison when they were negotiating the transition and so on and so forth. It's no accident that the Amhara nationalists say we are here to destroy Tegaru, TPLFites, and Onagawayan, OLFites. So our destiny is in some ways tied because of the principles we uphold. And I think it is important that all the other peoples of Ethiopia, particularly the Oromo and the TPLF, the Tigrayans, all over the world, join hands and try to put up a resistance that is comprehensive, that is full-time, that is sustained, that's systematic and coherent, speaking in one voice to make sure that this madness in the Horn of Africa stops. And for once, we go back to normal life and see if we can rebuild our societies from the ashes that they have been condemned to be in.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Ararssa and Dr. Young. It's a very interesting discussion, and we are so honored, the entire United Tegaru team, that you have joined us for this talk, especially Dr. Ararssa. I know it's a very inconvenient time for you, and we really appreciate you being here. Thank you to our attendees and listeners. That brings an end to our discussion today. Thank you all.